There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone says something so cruel in public that no one quite knows where to look. I know that silence now. I will carry it for the rest of my life. Not because it broke me, but because it was the moment I finally understood exactly what I was dealing with. And once you understand something clearly, you cannot go back to pretending you don't. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a school librarian in a mid-sized city in Ohio, which is to say, I spent 38 years being invisible in the most useful way imaginable. I organized things. I kept records. I knew where everything was, and I knew the value of patience, because a library teaches you that some books sit untouched for years. And then, one afternoon, someone walks in who needs exactly that book. And the fact that you kept it, tended it, believed in it, without seeing the outcome, is the whole point. I funded my son Connor's entire Master of Business Administration degree, every semester, every fee, every textbook order, 3 years and $214,000 routed through a university scholarship account in my name, because that is how I was told to structure it, quietly, correctly, without fanfare. At his graduation ceremony, in front of 147 people, my daughter-in-law Vivian stood up from her chair, pointed at me across the row, and said, "She paid for nothing. Don't let her pretend otherwise." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I waited until the ceremony was over, drove home in my 12-year-old Civic, made a cup of tea, and called the university's financial services office. The rest, as they say, followed naturally. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. But let me start at the beginning, because the graduation was not where this story began. It was simply where it became impossible to ignore. Connor was born in 1990 in the same hospital where I had worked as a volunteer during nursing school before I changed my path to library sciences. His father, Raymond Marsh, was a good man with a restless heart, the kind of man who was better at starting things than finishing them. He loved us, I believe that, but he loved the idea of a new start more. He left when Connor was 9. We heard from him at Christmas for a few years, and then we didn't. I raised Connor alone. I'm not saying this for sympathy. I'm saying it because it is the context for everything else, and context is the one thing people most often omit when they tell stories about money and family. We lived in a 2-bedroom house on Carmody Street. I grew a vegetable garden because it was cheaper than buying produce, and because I liked the discipline of it, the way you plant something in April and trust the outcome without being able to rush it. Connor did his homework at the kitchen table. I packed his lunch every morning with a note inside the bag, not because I saw it in a movie, but because my mother did it for me, and I never forgot how that felt. We were not wealthy. We were not struggling. We were the particular kind of stable that requires constant attention to maintain, the way a well-tuned instrument stays in tune only if someone keeps tuning it. I tuned it every day for 25 years. What Connor never knew, what I made a deliberate decision not to tell him, for reasons I will explain, is that sometime in the mid-90s, I inherited a modest sum from my Aunt Clara, who had no children of her own and who had spent her entire working life as a postal clerk in rural Pennsylvania, and invested every spare dollar into index funds because a man at her bank branch told her to in 1971, and she never stopped. The inheritance was $94,000. This was not a fortune, but in 1997, to a woman making $38,000 a year as a school librarian in Ohio, where $94,000 was a number that could become something if handled with care. I handled it with care. I did not tell Connor. I did not tell my sister. I put it with a fee-only financial advisor named Gerald Hooper, who wore the same brown cardigan every time I visited his office, and who never once tried to sell me anything complicated. And I told him I wanted to protect it and grow it slowly, and that my goal was to be able to pay for my son's education, in full, without debt. When the time came, Gerald nodded, wrote something down, and said, "That's a good goal. Let's build toward it." 20-some years later, when Connor was accepted to the MBA program at Harrington University, I sat down with Gerald one final time, and he showed me the number that the patients and the index funds and the compound interest had built. I called the university's financial aid and scholarship office. I explained what I wanted to do. They had a mechanism for it, a privately funded scholarship account that could be designated to a specific student, administered through the bursar's office, dispersed each semester. The student would see the funding on their financial aid summary listed as Eleanor Marsh Scholarship Fund, and they were welcome to know or not know what it meant. Connor knew. I told him, privately, before he accepted the offer. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where he'd done his homework as a boy, and I slid a sheet of paper across to him that showed the account balance and what it would cover. He was quiet for a long time. "Mom," he said, "it's yours," I said. "It was always going to be yours. I just needed time to grow it." He cried a little. He thanked me. He asked me not to tell Vivian right away. He wanted to figure out how to explain it, he said. He was worried she would feel strange about it, given her family's money. Vivian came from what people in our area would call serious money. Her father owned 3 car dealerships, and her mother sat on the board of a regional hospital. They lived in a house with a guest wing and a name, the way certain houses in certain suburbs have names, like properties in a novel. I told Connor I would let him handle the conversation in his own time. That conversation, as far as I could determine, never happened. I met Vivian at a dinner Connor arranged at a restaurant called Sable, which was the sort of place that prints menus without prices and assumes you already know what things cost. She was beautiful in the careful way of someone who has always had resources to spend on being beautiful. Precise highlights. A blazer that fit the way blazers fit only when they are made for you specifically. She shook my hand and smiled, and called me Eleanor, without asking whether I preferred that, which I registered but did not remark upon. She asked what I did. When I told her I was a retired librarian, she said, "Oh, how lovely!" The way people say things when they're already thinking about the next thing they want to say. She told me about her work. She managed social media marketing for a boutique hospitality group, and about her parents' home in Lake Marbury, Nias, and about a trip she and Connor had recently taken to Portugal. I had not known about the Portugal trip. Connor had mentioned they were taking time off. He had not mentioned Portugal. I ate my dinner. I asked questions. I listened. Vivian was not cruel that first dinner. She was something subtler, and in some ways more instructive. She was indifferent. She had assessed me, in the first 60 seconds of our acquaintance, as a person who occupied a specific and limited category: the modest mother, the librarian from Carmody Street, the background figure in her husband's biography. And having completed that assessment, she set it aside and directed her attention toward more interesting subjects. I noticed. I tucked it away. Connor and Vivian married the following spring in a ceremony at Vivian's parents' property in Lake Marbury. I was seated in the 3rd row, which I was told was because the photographer needed the first 2 rows for immediate family only. Vivian's immediate family occupied the 1st row. Connor's immediate family, which was me and my sister Linda, and Linda's 2 adult children, occupied the 3rd. I wore the blue dress I had bought for the occasion. It was a good dress. Linda leaned over during the ceremony and whispered, "3rd row." I said, "I know." She said, "You're paying for—" I said, "Shh." The reception was at a venue called Hargrove Hall, which was an event space that Vivian's father had built adjacent to the main house. There was a seating chart. My table was near the side exit, next to a pillar that partially obstructed the view of the dance floor. I sat next to a couple who were friends of Vivian's parents, and who spent the dinner discussing the renovation of their lake house. I ate the salmon. I watched my son dance with his wife. He looked happy. I told myself that was what mattered. When Connor began his MBA program 18 months later, Vivian's reaction to the news, or rather to the version of it Connor must have shared with her, was initially contained. She seemed pleased that Connor was advancing his career. She told people at dinner parties that her husband was getting his MBA from Harrington, which is a well-regarded program, and she mentioned it with the particular pride of someone whose family already had advanced degrees in multiple directions, but who was happy to add another. She did not, to my knowledge, might ask how it was being funded. Or perhaps she asked, and Connor gave her an answer that was not quite complete. I visited Connor's apartment, a handsome two-bedroom in the Millbrook district that I noticed was considerably nicer than anything I could have imagined affording in my mid-30s, twice during the first year of his program. Both times Vivian was home. Both times she was polite in the measured way she had been at dinner at Sable. Present, pleasant, calibrated, and fundamentally uninterested. She asked me, on my second visit, whether I was still doing the garden. I said yes. I'd had a good tomato yield. She said, "Oh, I can never keep plants alive. I've given up trying." She laughed. I laughed with her. We did not talk about the MBA funding. We did not talk about money at all. This suited me. I had not told Connor to hide anything. I had simply trusted him to have the conversation in his own way. But it was becoming clear that the conversation had not been had, and I was beginning to understand why. Because telling Vivian that his mother, the retired librarian from Carmody Street, was paying for his MBA would require Vivian to revise the story she had already built about who her husband was and where he came from. That revision, apparently, was not something Connor was prepared to force. I drove home on my second visit thinking about patience, about the library, about the way some things become clear only after you have waited long enough for them to reveal themselves. By the second year of Connor's program, Anita had begun to understand the texture of my relationship with Vivian more precisely. She did not call me. This was perhaps unsurprising. I was her mother-in-law, not her friend. But there was a quality to the not calling that was specific. When Connor and I spoke on the phone, which was weekly, Vivian was occasionally in the background. I could hear her. She did not ask to speak with me. If Connor said, "Say hi to Mom," I would hear a sound that might have been a hello and might have been something else, and then the conversation would continue. I was not invited to their home for holidays in the second year. Connor came to me for Thanksgiving, alone, because Vivian's family had a tradition in Lake Marbury that he was expected to attend. I understood this. I told him I understood this. But on the drive home from dropping him at the airport, I thought about the Thanksgiving I had spent teaching Connor to make pie crust. He must have been 12. And the way he'd been so proud when it came out right. And I thought about how small a kitchen on Carmody Street is, and how large the Hargrove property in Lake Marbury must be, and how those two things occupy different weights in a life. Christmas was similar. I received a card, a printed photograph of Connor and Vivian at a ski resort, wearing matching red sweaters, holding mugs, with Happy Holidays, Connor and Viv, written inside in Vivian's handwriting. Not Connor's, Vivian's, as though she had decided that the card sending was her domain and had simply incorporated his name into it. My sister Linda called me on Christmas afternoon. "Did you get the card?" "Yes." "She didn't write love." "No," I said. "She didn't." There was a pause. Linda said, "Elle, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to tend the garden," I said. "I'm going to wait and see." "You're too patient," Linda said. "I'm the right amount of patient," I said. I believed that. I still do. Patience is not the same as passivity. I was watching. I was building a picture, the way you build a picture in a library, catalog by catalog, record by record, until the collection tells you something you couldn't see from any single volume. The picture became clearer in the spring of the second year. Connor called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. We spoke on Sundays. And he sounded careful in the way he sounds when he is managing something. "Mom. Quick question." "All right. Viv's parents are helping us think about buying something. A house, in Millbrook." I waited. "The thing is, her dad wants to contribute, which is great, and I was wondering if If there was any flexibility with the scholarship account, whether any of it could be redirected. I was quiet for a moment. The account is designated for educational expenses, I said. That's how it was structured. It can only be dispersed toward tuition, fees, and approved academic costs. Right. Yeah, I figured. Are you managing the tuition payments from your end? You have enough? Yeah, we're fine. It's just, he paused. Viv's dad is covering a big chunk of the down payment. And I didn't want it to feel like one side was doing everything, you know? I understood what he was saying. He wanted Vivian's father to feel like a full partner in the house purchase. And the easiest way to create that impression was to ensure no competing contribution was visible. Since my contribution was invisible by design, a scholarship account at a university bursar's office, rather than a check written to Connor personally, there was no awkward comparison. What Connor wanted was, I understood now, for it to stay invisible. The account is what it is, I said gently, but you don't have any tuition debt from what I've covered, so you're in a very strong position regardless. Is Vivian? She knows we're in good shape, he said, a little quickly. She just doesn't know all the details. All right, I said. We talked for a few more minutes about other things. His thesis, his internship, a trip they were planning for the summer. I said goodnight. I hung up. I sat for a while in my reading chair, the one I've had for 20 years, with my tea going cold beside me. The lamp was on. Outside, the Carmody Street neighborhood was quiet. I thought about what I had just heard. Not the surface of it, the house purchase, the father-in-law, the down payment, but what was underneath it. Connor knew I was funding his MBA. He had known for 3 years. He had, by design or by drift, arranged it so that Vivian did not know. And now he was in a situation where 2 different sources of family support were converging on his life. My invisible scholarship and Vivian's father's very visible check. And he was trying to manage the appearance of each so that neither created discomfort. I understood the impulse. I did not fully respect it, but I understood it. What I could not quite see yet was this. What story had Connor told Vivian? Not the full story. I knew she didn't have that. But what partial story? What did Vivian believe about how the MBA was being paid for? I would not learn the answer to that question until the graduation ceremony, 14 months later, when Vivian stood up in that hall in front of 147 people and told me, and everyone else, exactly what she believed. The 3rd year of Connor's program was the year I began to feel the edges of something sharpen. I attended a dinner at Connor and Vivian's house in March, the Millbrook house they had purchased, a beautiful craftsman with original woodwork and a garden that I noticed had been allowed to go to weeds along the back fence. I brought a lemon cake. I brought a plant for the garden, a climbing rose, in a biodegradable pot. Vivian accepted the cake without comment. The rose she set near the back door with a vague, "That's so thoughtful." And I noticed, when I glanced toward the door an hour later, that it had been moved to just beside the bin. The dinner was the 3 of us, which was already unusual. Vivian preferred company in groups, I had observed, and the 2-on-1 ratio of a private family dinner made her visibly less comfortable. She spent much of the meal on her phone in a way she must have believed was subtle, but was not. When she did engage, she spoke primarily to Connor, in the coded shorthand of couples, references to people and events I had no context for. And when she addressed me, it was usually to ask something safely neutral. Do you still do your garden? Eleanor? Yes. And you're reading? You were a librarian. Still reading, yes. Lovely. At one point in the evening, Connor mentioned his thesis presentation. He was presenting to a panel in April, and said something about how the scholarship had covered the conference registration fee, as well as the last semester's tuition. He said it casually, without looking at Vivian. I kept my face still. I picked up my fork. Vivian said, "What scholarship?" A small silence. Connor said, "The Harrington Merit Award. I mentioned it." You said it was merit-based? It's, yeah, it's based on academic achievement and financial planning, and I thought you were on the department fellowship. I was, in the first year. Ah, this was different. Vivian looked at him with an expression I recognized, the slightly narrowed focus of someone who senses a gap between what they're being told and what is actually true, but who has decided this is not the moment to press it. She glanced at me once. I picked up my water glass. The subject changed. The dinner continued. In the car on the way home, alone, in my Civic, I sat in the driveway on Carmody Street for a while before going inside. Connor had told Vivian it was a merit scholarship, not that it was named after his mother, not that it was funded by his mother's inheritance and 30 years of careful investment. A merit scholarship, the kind of thing that happens to deserving people from no identifiable source, like weather. I understood the impulse. I still did not fully respect it. But now I was watching something I had not quite seen clearly before. This was not just Connor managing information. This was Connor having told a story, a specific, deliberate story, about where the money came from, and the story did not include me. I was the one paying. I was the one who had been invisible by design, at his request, and he had taken that invisibility and used it to build a narrative in which I had not contributed at all. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about 38 years of library work. I thought about Aunt Clara's postal clerk's salary, invested faithfully since 1971. I thought about Gerald Hooper in his brown cardigan. I thought about the seed packets I buy in March, the ones that say days to harvest on the back, because the thing about a garden is that you always have to account for the time. I went inside. I made tea. I did not call Connor. I waited. 4 months later, the graduation invitations went out. Connor's MBA commencement was scheduled for a Saturday morning in July at the Harrington University Performing Arts Center, a handsome building with good acoustics and seats for just over 300. Connor was allowed 4 guest tickets. I received mine in the mail, a cream envelope with the university seal, a seat in Row D, Section Center. Row D, Section Center. Not the back, not beside a pillar. The middle of the room, where a mother sits when her child knows she belongs there. I called Connor. I got the ticket, thank you. Of course, Mom. He sounded warm. He sounded like himself, the boy who'd stood at my kitchen table crying because I showed him a number in a spreadsheet. It means a lot that you'll be there. I wouldn't miss it. I bought a new dress, navy blue, simple, good. I drove to the Harrington University Performing Arts Center on a Saturday morning in July, parked in visitor parking, and walked inside. The lobby smelled of coffee and cut flowers. Families moved in clusters, parents with cameras, siblings checking phones, grandparents in good shoes. I found my seat in Row D. I sat down. I arranged my program in my lap. To my right was a couple I didn't know, parents of another graduate, who were from Indianapolis and who were very excited and who offered me a breath mint, which I accepted. To my left were 2 empty seats. Those seats, I learned shortly before the ceremony began, were for Vivian and her mother, Diane Hargrove, who arrived together, glossy and coordinated, sharing in a way that suggested they had dressed with each other in mind. Vivian sat in the seat immediately to my left. Diane sat beside her. Vivian looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Eleanor, you made it. Of course, I said. Such a long drive from... She paused, as if she was calculating. Where is it you live? Carmody something? Carmody Street, I said. About 40 minutes? Right. She settled into her seat, opened her program. Mother, this is Connor's mother, Eleanor. Diane Hargrove looked at me with the particular warmth of someone who has been briefed. Eleanor, I've heard lovely things. I thanked her. I was fairly certain she had heard nothing specific about me at all. The ceremony began. The dean spoke. A faculty marshal led the procession. The graduates filed in by department. And when Connor appeared in his regalia, dark gown, gold hood, the particular walk of someone trying not to look like they're grinning too broadly, I felt the thing I always feel, the thing that cannot be explained to anyone who hasn't raised a child alone, the complete and overwhelming pride that arrives without permission, that you feel in your chest before your brain has caught up. I pressed my hands together in my lap. Vivian took a photograph on her phone. Diane Hargrove whispered something to Vivian. Vivian whispered back. The graduates were seated. The speeches continued. Then came the moment when, prior to the individual name-calling, the dean announced several scholarship distinctions, honors and awards, and among them, the Eleanor Marsh Scholarship, which was listed in the program as having been awarded to Connor William Marsh, Department of Business Administration. It was perhaps 20 seconds of ceremony, a mention in a printed program. The dean's voice, steady and clear, saying, "The Eleanor Marsh Scholarship, awarded annually to a student demonstrating academic excellence and financial stewardship, this year presented to Connor William Marsh." I heard Vivian's breath change beside me. I looked straight ahead. I heard her say, quietly, to her mother, "What is that?" I heard Diane say something I couldn't make out. I heard Vivian say, "Named after..." And then the ceremony moved on, and Connor's name was called in the sequence, and he walked across the stage, and I stood with everyone else, and I clapped for my son. It was after the ceremony, in the lobby, in the cluster of families and flowers and photographs, that it happened. Connor was surrounded immediately by a group of his classmates and their families. The particular chaos of a graduation lobby, where everyone is trying to photograph the same 10 square feet. Vivian had positioned herself at his side in the way she always did in public. A slight forward lean, a hand on the arm. Diane Hargrove was nearby. I stood at the edge of this cluster. I was waiting for Connor to turn and see me, the way a person waits at the edge of a crowd at a train station, patient, certain, knowing the moment will arrive. And then Vivian's mother said something to Vivian. I couldn't hear what. And Vivian turned and looked directly at me, and something happened in her face that I had never quite seen there before. Not the calibrated indifference of the dinner at Sable or the Millbrook dining room. Something sharper, something cornered. She said, "Is that your scholarship? On the program?" The cluster around Connor had gone slightly quiet. Not silent. People were still talking, glasses clinking from somewhere, someone's child asking to go to the bathroom. But the immediate group, the 6 or 7 people in our immediate orbit, had tuned in. I said, "Yes." "You funded it?" I said, "Yes." There was a pause. And then, I will carry this moment for the rest of my life, not because it was devastating, but because it was so perfectly, completely revealing. Vivian turned toward the group, toward the people around Connor, and she said, "She paid for nothing. Don't let her pretend otherwise." She said it clearly. She said it with the confidence of someone who has checked their facts, who is correcting a misunderstanding, who is performing a public service. She gestured at me with an open hand, the way a person gestures at a chart. Connor's face, I saw it across the group, went the particular pale of someone who knows that a contained fire has just lost its container. The silence that followed was the particular silence I described at the beginning of this story. The kind where no one knows where to look. I looked at Vivian. I said, "All right." I said it quietly. I said it evenly. I said it the way you set something fragile on a shelf when you know you will need to return to it. And then I smiled at my son. A real smile, a full one, because I was genuinely proud of him. Whatever else was true. And I said, "I'll let you visit with your friends. Congratulations, sweetheart." I picked up my bag. I walked through the lobby. I walked out of the Harrington University Performing Arts Center into the July sunlight. I drove home in my 12-year-old Civic. I made a cup of tea. I sat in my reading chair, the one I've had for 20 years, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and I thought about what Vivian had said and what it meant. Not just what she had said. That was clear enough. The words were simple enough. but what it revealed about what she believed, what Connor had told her, what he had allowed her to believe. She had said it with certainty. She had not said it as an accusation or a question. She had said it as a fact she was confident in, as a correction she was entitled to make. And she paid for nothing. So the story Connor had told, or allowed, was not just that the scholarship was merit-based, awarded by the university for achievement. The story was, apparently, that the money had no connection to me at all, that I was a woman from Carmody Street who showed up to events and contributed nothing, who perhaps even implied otherwise, and who needed to be corrected by someone who knew better. I had been paying for 3 years, for $214,000, and the person sitting to my left at the graduation ceremony had believed with total confidence that I had paid for nothing. I sat with this information for a long time. Then I picked up my phone. I called the university on a Monday morning, not because I needed the weekend to work up the courage. I needed the weekend to be certain, absolutely certain, that what I was about to do was the right thing, and not merely the satisfying thing, because those two categories overlap more than people admit, and I have always believed the overlap is where the most damage gets done. By Sunday evening, I was certain. The financial services office at Harrington University opens at 8:30. I called at 8:32. A woman named Patricia answered, and I gave her my name, and she said, "Oh, Mrs. Marsh. Yes, I have your file right here. Congratulations on your son's graduation." "Thank you," I said. "Patricia, I need to discuss the scholarship account. Specifically, I need to understand the terms around the annual renewal disbursement." There was the sound of typing. "Of course." The Eleanor Marsh Scholarship Fund was structured as a renewable annual award, disbursed each semester upon confirmation of enrollment and academic standing. The current academic year's disbursement has been completed. The next disbursement would be scheduled for the fall semester. But your son has graduated, so the fund would roll to its next designated recipient unless you have designated otherwise. "I haven't designated otherwise," I said, "but I'd like to talk about the remaining balance." More typing. "The remaining balance in the fund is, let me pull this up, $71,420. I had structured the account conservatively, disbursing by semester rather than in full at the start of the program, which meant a buffer remained. Gerald Hooper had suggested this arrangement 3 years ago, high sitting in his office in his brown cardigan, and I had agreed without knowing exactly why it felt right. Now I knew why. "Patricia," I said, "I'd like to freeze the account pending a review of the disbursement structure." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You'd like to place a hold on the fund balance?" "Yes. No disbursements, no transfers, nothing in or out until I've had a chance to speak with someone in the office about next steps." "I can do that," she said. "I'll flag the account and set up a hold. Can I ask, is there a concern about how the funds were used? We do have a compliance process if—" "No concern about compliance," I said. "I simply want to understand my options before making a decision about the remaining balance." "Of course, I'll place the hold today. You'll receive a confirmation email, and we can schedule a call with our scholarship advisory team whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Patricia." I hung up. I drank my tea. I opened my email, and within 20 minutes, the confirmation arrived. Account hold. Eleanor Marsh Scholarship Fund. Effective Monday. Status: all disbursements suspended pending account holder review. I printed it. I put it in the file folder I keep in the second drawer of my desk, the one that contains every document related to the scholarship from the very beginning. The original account setup, the semester disbursement records, the confirmation receipts, the financial advisor correspondence. 38 pages of documentation for 3 years of invisible generosity. I closed the drawer. I went out to tend the garden, because it was a Monday morning in July, and the climbing rose I'd planted along the back fence was finally beginning to establish itself, sending thin new tendrils up the trellis I'd put in last spring. Plants do not know about graduation ceremonies. They do not know about public humiliations, or frozen scholarship accounts, or women who say things in lobbies with the confidence of people who have never been wrong. They know about light and water and time. I watered the rose. I pulled 3 weeks of weeds from the vegetable bed. I went inside and made lunch and did not think about Connor until he called at 2 in the afternoon. He called on my cell phone, which I leave on the kitchen counter when I'm in the garden, and by the time I came in from watering, it had already rung twice and gone to voicemail twice. When it rang the third time, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing my hands, and I dried them on the dish towel and picked up. Mom. He sounded the way he had sounded when he was 12 and had broken something. Not frightened exactly, but braced. Preemptively apologetic. Connor. I've been trying to reach you. I was in the garden. A pause. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said. I sat down at the kitchen table. How are you? Mom! His voice dropped. I need to talk to you about Saturday. All right. What Viv said, she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She was... Connor, I said. I'd like to ask you something before we talk about what she said. He stopped. What did you tell Vivian about the scholarship? Specifically, what words did you use? A silence that told me almost everything. Then, I told her it was a university merit award. That's what you told her. I didn't want to make a big thing of it. Her family, her dad, they have money, you know, and I didn't want it to be this comparison. I didn't want her to feel like I was coming in with a handout from my side. That's what you were worried about, how it would look to her family. It wasn't, Mom, it wasn't that simple. Did you tell her the scholarship was named after me? Another silence. No. Did you tell her I funded it? No. So what she said at the ceremony, she said it because she genuinely believed it was true. She believed I had paid for nothing. Yes, she thought. I guess she thought you were implying. When the name came up on the program, she thought I was taking credit for something I hadn't done. He didn't answer. I looked out the kitchen window at the garden. The rose was still there, the new tendrils reaching. Connor, I said, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I want you to do it before we speak again. What? I want you to tell Vivian the truth, all of it. Where the money came from, how the account was structured, what it paid for, and why you told her what you told her instead. Mom, I'm not angry at you, I said, and I meant it, more or less. But I am asking you to do that. And then, I'd like the two of you to call me together. She's going to feel terrible. Perhaps, I said. That's between you and her. I'd just like her to have the full picture before we talk. He said he would. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, in the overlapping way he'd apologized as a boy, when he'd broken something, circling the apology as if repetition would hasten its acceptance. I listened to all of it. I told him again that I loved him, and that I would talk to him soon, and I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then I called my sister Linda. Linda is 4 years younger than me, and has always been the more expressive of the two of us, which means that when I told her what had happened at the ceremony, she said approximately everything I had not said in the lobby of the Harrington Performing Arts Center in a sustained and thorough manner for about 6 minutes. I let her finish. Are you done? I said. No, she said, but I'll stop. I froze the scholarship account. A pause. The remaining balance? 71,000. Eleanor. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it yet. I wanted to protect it first. Of course you did. A longer pause. What does Connor know? He knows I called. He doesn't know about the freeze yet. Are you going to tell him? When the time is right, I said. When Vivian knows the full story and they've had time to sit with it. And then? Then we'll see what kind of conversation we're actually having. Linda was quiet for a moment. I could hear her in her kitchen. The the way I always can. The background sounds of her house, her particular domestic atmosphere, familiar to me since childhood. Then she said, "You know what Mama would say. Mama would say, 'Don't let them make you small,'" I said. "Yes, she would say that. I don't intend to." The call from Connor and Vivian came on Wednesday evening, 4 days after the graduation, 2 days after I had spoken to Connor alone. I knew it was coming because Connor texted me that afternoon. "Mom, can we call tonight, the three of us?" 7 o'clock. I texted back, "Yes." At 7 o'clock, my phone rang. I picked up. Connor said hello. There was a half beat of quiet, and then Vivian said hello, her voice carrying a particular quality I had not heard in it before. Not the calibrated pleasantness of the dinner at Sable, not the indifference of the Millbrook dining room, but something that sounded uncomfortably close to genuine. "Eleanor," she said. "Vivian," I said. "Connor told me everything." "All right. I want to say that I'm sorry. For what I said at the ceremony. I'm very sorry." I let the apology land. I did not rush past it, or cushion it, or redirect it. I let it sit in the air between us the way I had been taught to let silence sit, as something that has weight, that does not need to be filled. "Thank you," I said. "I genuinely didn't know," she said. "I want you to understand that. I wasn't trying to." "I believe you didn't know," I said. "That's actually part of what I'd like to talk about." A pause. "Okay. Vivienne, I don't think you're a cruel person." She was quiet. "I think you made an assumption about who I am and what I'm capable of, and you made it early. Maybe when Connor first introduced us, or maybe before that, and you never had any reason to question it because Connor never gave you the information that would have changed it. That's not entirely your fault, but it isn't entirely Connor's either." "Mom," Connor started. "I'm not finished," I said gently. "What I'd like is for the three of us to understand each other clearly, not to relitigate the ceremony or assign blame for who told what to whom, just to be honest about where we are." "Of course," Vivian said. "The scholarship account," I said. "Do you understand how it was structured?" Connor explained it. "You set it up through the university's financial services. The disbursements went directly to tuition and fees." "That's right. The remaining balance is $71,000. I've placed a hold on the account." Silence. "A hold," Connor said. "A temporary freeze, pending my decision about what to do with the remaining funds. Since you've graduated, Connor, the account would normally roll to a new designated recipient or be closed out. I wanted to pause before making that decision." "What does that mean for us?" Vivian asked. Her voice was careful. "It means the money isn't going anywhere without my direction. It also means I have some time to think about whether and how I want it to continue to be part of our relationship." Connor said, "Mom, I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying you might not?" "I'm saying I haven't decided yet," I said. "I'm saying that I funded your education because I love you and because it was the right thing to do, and because Aunt Clara's patients deserve to amount to something good in this world. So I'm not angry about having done it. But I spent 3 years being invisible by your request, Connor. And on the day that invisibility ended, the day my name appeared in that program, the first public statement made about my contribution was that I had made none. The silence on the line was absolute. "That's not a small thing," I said. "I think you both understand that." "Yes," Vivian said, very quietly. "So here is what I'd like," I said. "I'd like some time, a few weeks. I'd like you both to think about what this relationship looks like when it's honest, what it looks like when I'm not the librarian from Carmody Street who shows up and contributes nothing, but Eleanor, who is Connor's mother, who raised him alone, who tended something carefully for 30 years so that he could have this. Why, I'd like you to think about what it means to let someone actually exist in your life." No one spoke. "And then I'd like to have dinner," the three of us, and talk. And if that conversation goes well, if it feels like something real is possible, then we can talk about what happens with the remainder of the fund. And if it doesn't go well? Vivian asked. Then I'll decide what to do with $71,000 in some other way, I said. There are a great many good uses for that amount of money. I've been giving it a lot of thought. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because they were not simple, and I think the simplicity is often what stories like this leave out, the part where the reckoning happens slowly, where people are not immediately transformed by a phone call or a confrontation, but instead move through their discomfort the way a season moves, which is to say, gradually and with occasional reversals. Connor called me 4 times in the first week after our three-way conversation. Twice he called just to talk. About his job search, about a book he was reading, about a leak they'd discovered in the Millbrook house's basement. These were not calls designed to manage me or negotiate with me. They were the calls of a son who was, perhaps for the first time in some years, remembering who his mother actually was and reaching toward her. The third call was harder. He asked me directly whether I was punishing him. He asked it plainly, not defensively, which I appreciated. I said, "No, I'm not punishing you. Say punishment would be resentment dressed as principle. What I'm doing is more like clearing a space, making sure that what comes next is built on something honest." He said, "I should have told her from the beginning." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I think I was ashamed. I sat with that. Ashamed of what? Of needing it, of not being able to do it myself. Her family, they don't take from people, they give. They're always the ones giving, and I didn't want her to see me as someone who needed his mother to pay his way. "Connor," I said, "she comes from people who give because they have so much it costs them nothing to give. That is a very different thing from receiving a gift from someone who gave you everything they had." He was quiet. "There is nothing shameful about being loved," I said. "There is nothing shameful about a mother doing something extraordinary for her child. The shame, if there is any, is in hiding it." "I know. And the next time—" "There won't be a next time," he said. "I promise." I believed him. I believe people when they've had the particular experience of having something hidden collapse in a public lobby because there is no better education than that kind of visibility. Vivian called me once during those weeks. On her own, not with Connor. On a Thursday afternoon when I was making bread, my phone propped against the bread box with her name on the screen. I answered with flour on my hands. "Eleanor? Do you have a moment?" "I'm making bread," I said. "But yes." A small pause. I've been thinking about what you said. About letting someone exist in your life." I think I don't think I ever really thought about you, as a person. That sounds terrible." "It's honest," I said. "I thought of you as Connor's background, his history, the woman from Carmody Street." "Yes, and I don't know why I decided that mattered. Or rather, I do know, and it's not very flattering." "You don't have to flatter yourself," I said. "That's not what I'm asking for." "What are you asking for?" I punched the bread dough once, firmly. "I'm asking to matter. Not to be impressive, not to be wealthy, not to come from the right kind of house. Just to matter. To be a person in your life who exists fully, not as backdrop." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My mother never liked Connor's background. She didn't say it directly. She said things like, 'He's very self-made,' and 'he's worked hard to get where he is,' which in our family is a specific kind of compliment that contains a specific kind of condescension." "Yes," I said. "I imagine it does. I think I absorbed some of that. And I think I applied it to you without thinking about it. Because you were his mother, and he came from you, and if he was self-made, then I was something to be risen above." "Yes," she said, very quietly. "I'm sorry." I kneaded the dough. Outside the kitchen window, the summer afternoon was bright and still. Vivienne, I said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable. All right. Do you love my son? She didn't hesitate. Yes, very much. And does he make you happy? He does. He's a good person. He's better than I deserve sometimes. He's not better than anyone deserves, I said. He's just good. I made him that way, which I say not to take credit, but to explain why I will not watch someone diminish him by making him ashamed of where he comes from. A silence. No, she said. I wouldn't want that either. Good, I said. Then we have something to build on. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Sarah Mitchell. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. The dinner happened 6 weeks after the graduation ceremony, not at a restaurant. At my house on Carmody Street. I cooked. I made the things I know how to make well, without performance or apology. Roast chicken, potatoes from the garden, a green salad, the lemon cake I'd brought to the Millbrook house, and whose twin Vivian had relocated toward the bin. I set the table in the dining room, which I use perhaps 4 times a year, with the cloth my mother embroidered in the 1970s, and the good dishes that were a wedding gift when Raymond and I married, and which I have kept because they are still beautiful regardless of what became of the marriage. Connor arrived first, alone, because Vivian had texted that she was parking. He stood at the door with a bottle of wine and looked at the table through the dining room archway and said, Mom, you didn't have to do all this. I wanted to, I said. He hugged me, properly, the way he used to when he was small, arms fully around, chin on my shoulder. I let myself hold it for a moment. Is everything? Everything is fine, I said. Come in. Vivian arrived 3 minutes later. She stood on the front step of the house on Carmody Street. I had repainted the trim that spring, a deep green that I liked against the red brick, and she looked at the house in a way that suggested she was seeing it for the first time, which I suppose she was, since she had never come here before. She had a small bouquet, dahlias, which are my favorite flower, which I have in the garden, which meant someone had told her. Eleanor, she said. Come in, I said. I'll put those in water. She came in. She looked at the bookshelves that line the hallway, floor to ceiling, double stacked in places, saw the accumulated reading of a librarian's lifetime. And she stopped. She stood there for a moment, her head slightly tilted, the way people stand in front of things that unexpectedly require attention. These are all yours? All of them, I said. 38 years of collecting. Some of them were my mother's. She moved a few steps down the hall, reading spines. Connor grew up with all of this. He did. He read everything in the lower shelves before he was 10. We had to rearrange by the time he was 12 to put the next level within reach. She turned and looked at me. Something in her face was open in a way I had not seen before. Not the careful pleasantness or the calibrated indifference, but something that looked more like genuine curiosity, the kind that arrives when a person's preconceptions have been quietly contradicted. He never told me that, she said. No, I said. He didn't tell you a lot of things. We went into the dining room. The dinner lasted almost 3 hours. We talked, which was different from the conversations we had had before. Not the polite adjacency of the dinner at Sable or the Millbrook visit, but actual talking, the kind where people say things they mean. Vivian asked me about the library. Not, oh, how lovely, but actual questions. What I'd cataloged, what the hardest part of the work was, how the collection had changed over 38 years. She asked about my mother, about Aunt Clara, about the inheritance and Gerald Hooper and the index funds. Connor sat across from us, and I could see him listening to his wife ask his mother questions that had never been asked. And his face had an expression I recognized from his childhood. The look of someone who is discovering something was always right there. I told them about the day I decided to set up the scholarship account. I told them about the particular logic of it, the structured disbursements, the semester-by-semester approach, Gerald's advice about maintaining a buffer. I told them about the specific morning I got the confirmation email from the university that the first semester's tuition had cleared. I was in the garden, I said. I had my phone in my apron pocket because I was waiting for the confirmation. It came at 10:14 in the morning. I read it standing next to the tomato plants. And then I went back to weeding. Vivian looked at me. Why didn't you tell anyone? Connor asked me not to, and I respected that. Why, even when I perhaps shouldn't have. I should have told you from the beginning, Connor said. To Vivian directly. I know that. I was embarrassed, and it was stupid to be embarrassed, and I'm sorry. Vivian reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I know, she said. And then, to me, I'm sorry too, for what I said, for who I was, toward you, for all of it. I know, I said. We had the lemon cake. We had another glass of wine. At some point, the evening had gone soft, the way long dinners do, the hour when everyone has stopped checking the time. Vivian said, What will you do with the rest? The 71,000. I had been thinking about this. I had spent 6 weeks thinking about it. I'm going to establish a scholarship, I said. A real one. Open, named after Aunt Clara, Clara Josephine Marden, in full, because she was a postal clerk from rural Pennsylvania who invested faithfully in index funds for 40 years and turned very little into quite a lot, and I think people should know her name. For what kind of students? Connor asked. First-generation university students. Students who are the first in their families to pursue advanced degrees, who don't have parental wealth to draw on, who need someone to believe they're worth the investment. I looked at my son. The kind of student I would have been if Clara Josephine Marden had done this for me. The kind of student you were, even if no one was supposed to say it out loud. Connor was quiet. I think it's beautiful, Vivian said. She said it simply, without embellishment, and it was the most genuine thing I had heard from her. So do I said. I want to be careful here, the way I am always careful when a story approaches its resolution, because resolution is the part most often falsified, made too clean, made too complete, made to sound like an ending when life has no endings, only continuances. Vivian and I are not close friends. We are not going to become the kind of mother and daughter-in-law who call each other spontaneously, who share inside jokes, who text photographs of things that reminded them of each other. We are too different for that, too formed by our different lives, and I do not think pretending otherwise would serve either of us. But we are honest with each other now. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. She called me in August to ask whether she could come and see the garden. Just to see it. No particular occasion, no structured visit. She brought a hat against the sun and her own garden gloves, which told me she'd thought about it in advance. We spent 2 hours outside. I showed her the rose I'd planted along the back fence. She crouched beside it and looked at the new growth carefully, the way a person looks at something they want to understand. How long before it blooms properly? She asked. Another season, I said. Maybe 2. Climbing roses take time. She nodded, still looking at it. Most good things do, she said. It was the smartest thing she had ever said to me, and I told her so, and she laughed, and it was a real laugh, without calibration, and I thought, there it is. There is the person underneath the person. We had tea afterward, at the kitchen table, where Connor did his homework. And she asked me to show her how the scholarship account worked, because she had an idea. Her company, the Boutique Hospitality Group, ran a community foundation, and she thought there might be a way to match donations to the Clara Josephine Marden Fund through corporate giving. I told her I'd talked to Gerald Hooper. She said, You still have a financial advisor? Gerald has been advising me for 26 years, I said. He wears the same cardigan. He has never tried to sell me anything complicated. She said, I want to meet Gerald. I did not have to end my son's world. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. Because the lesson of this story is not that punishment is the correct response to betrayal, or that a frozen account is the appropriate reply to a public humiliation. The lesson is something quieter and more precise. The lesson is that the woman you dismiss because she seems modest, because she comes from Carmody Street, because she grows tomatoes and drives a 12-year-old Civic and spent 38 years organizing other people's books, that woman may have been quietly building something for 30 years that will determine the shape of your future. And the lesson is that when you discover this, the question is not how to apologize for the dismissal. The question is whether you are capable of actually seeing the person who was always there. Whether you can revise the story you built and replace it with the truth. Whether you are, in the deepest sense, big enough for an honest life. Vivian, it turned out, was big enough. She needed the information, and she needed the confrontation. And she needed 6 weeks of sitting with it. But she was big enough. Connor needed to stop being ashamed of where he came from, which is a different and harder thing, and which I think he is still working on, and which I intend to be patient about because patience is what I know how to do. The Clara Josephine Marden Scholarship was formally established in the autumn. Gerald Hooper set it up through a charitable trust, which turned out to be a more appropriate vehicle than the university scholarship account. Broader, more flexible, better for growth. Vivian's company contributed a matching grant from their foundation. The first round of applications opened in October. The first recipient was a 24-year-old woman named Daphne Osei, who was applying to a graduate program in library science. She was the first in her family to pursue a graduate degree. She had grown up, she wrote in her application essay, spending her afternoons at her local public library because her apartment was small and loud, and the library was large and quiet, and there was always a librarian who remembered her name. I read her application at my kitchen table. I read it 3 times. Then I approved it, and I put the file away, and I went outside to check on the climbing rose. It was October. The rose had set 2 new canes along the trellis, reaching upward the way canes do, without certainty about where they are going, but in the right direction. By spring, there would be growth. By next summer, if the season cooperated, the first blooms. You plant things in April and trust the outcome without being able to rush it. I stood in the garden on Carmody Street in the October afternoon, and I thought about Clara Josephine Marden, who sorted mail in rural Pennsylvania and invested faithfully and never knew the name Daphne Osei, and about how the things we do with patience and without witness are often the things that matter most in the end. I went inside. I made tea. I sat in my reading chair, the lamp on, the evening settling around the house. My phone lit up. A text from Connor. Heard from Viv about the first scholarship recipient. Mom. That's incredible. A text from Vivian, a few seconds later. Daphne sounds extraordinary. So proud to have contributed. Thank you for letting us be part of it. I read both texts. I set the phone down. I picked up my book. Outside on Carmody Street, the autumn evening was quiet and ordinary, and entirely mine. There is something I did not tell you about the 6 weeks between the phone call and the dinner. I told you they were not simple, and that is true. I told you Connor called 4 times. I told you Vivian called once, on a Thursday afternoon, while I was making bread. I told you I believed them both when they said they were sorry, and I do believe them, and that is also true. But I left something out. I left it out deliberately, because it belongs here, in this part of the story, after the resolution has had a chance to settle, because some things are easier to say when you are standing on the other side of them, when the outcome is known, when you can speak about the painful moments without being inside them anymore. What I left out is this. There were 3 days in the second week after the graduation ceremony when I was not certain I would have the dinner at all. 3 days in which I sat with the question, not the performing of it, not the articulation of it for someone else's benefit, but the actual private question, the one you ask yourself in a reading chair at 10 o'clock at night with no one watching, of whether some things, once done publicly, cannot be undone privately. Vivian had stood up in a room of 147 people and said that I had paid for nothing. She had said it with certainty. She had said it as correction, as fact, as the kind of public clarification you make when someone is misrepresenting the truth and you feel entitled to set the record straight. And the particular cruelty of that, the specific texture of it, was not that she had been unkind. It was that she had been confident. She had believed it completely. She had looked at me across that lobby and seen a woman taking credit she hadn't earned, and she had corrected the record without hesitation, because that is what you do when the truth is clear and someone is muddying it. She had been wrong, and she had been completely wrong, and she had said it in front of my son's colleagues and their families and the people who would make up the social world of his professional life going forward. And Connor had let her believe it for 3 years. On the third evening of those 3 days, a Tuesday, night I remember because I had been to the garden center in the morning, and my car still smelled faintly of potting soil. I sat in my reading chair, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, not the managed, considered, patient version of the feeling, the actual thing, unmediated. I had spent 38 years as a librarian. I had spent 25 years raising a son alone on a single income, packing lunch notes, tuning the instrument of our life every single day. I had inherited $94,000 from a woman who sorted mail for 40 years and trusted a man at a bank in 1971. And I had taken that inheritance and grown it slowly and carefully and over decades into something that meant my son would not begin his professional life in debt. I had done all of this quietly, because he asked me to, but because I trusted him to handle the story in his own time, because I am a person who believes that patience is its own form of dignity. And the return on all of that, the public return, the moment when it surfaced in the world, was a woman standing up in a lobby and telling the assembled company that I had contributed nothing. On that Tuesday evening, I cried. Not the polite, controlled kind that I had permitted myself at various difficult moments over the previous weeks. The other kind. The kind that has no audience and makes no claims, and is simply what happens when a person allows herself to feel the full size of something she has been measuring in careful portions. I cried for perhaps 20 minutes. Then I washed my face. Then I made tea. Then I sat back down. And I thought, all right, what is actually true? What is actually true is that I funded my son's education, and he is educated, and that is not undone by anyone's public statement. What is actually true is that the scholarship account exists, and the disbursement records exist, and Gerald Hooper's files exist, and none of that requires Vivian Hargrove Marsh's acknowledgement to be real. What is actually true is that the $71,000 is still there, in a frozen account, and what I do with it will be decided by me. What is actually true is that my son loves me. I have never doubted this. I have sometimes doubted his courage, and his honesty, and his willingness to put difficult truths in the path of his comfort, but not his love. The love has always been there. It was there in the lobby when his face went pale. It was there in his voice on the phone, circling the apology. It was there in the fact that he came to me every Sunday without fail for 3 years, that he talked to me about his thesis and his program and his professors, that he sent me photographs of the Millbrook house when they bought it and asked what I thought of the garden. He loved me. He had simply, somewhere along the way, learned to love me quietly, tucked away like the scholarship itself, invisible by design, managed for the comfort of other people. That was what I was actually asking him to change. On the 4th morning, I got up and went to the garden and watered the rose and decided that the dinner would happen. What I also did not tell you is that Diane Hargrove called me. This was in the 4th week. A number I didn't recognize. An Arizona area code, which confused me briefly. I don't know anyone in Arizona. And then a voice I recognized from the graduation ceremony. Vivian's mother, measured and warm in the particular way of women who have spent decades performing graciousness. Eleanor, I hope this isn't an imposition. Diane? I said. No, it's fine. How did you? Vivienne gave me your number. She said she thought I should call. I sat down. All right. I want to say something to you directly, and I want to ask you not to hold it against Vivienne that I'm calling, because this is my idea and my responsibility. Go ahead. A pause. I could hear her arranging herself, the sound of a woman who is accustomed to having rooms accommodate themselves to her, deciding how to proceed in a situation where that power doesn't fully apply. I owe you an apology, she said. I had not expected that. Do you? Not for what Vivienne said at the ceremony. That's hers to own. But for the context that made it possible, for the way our family talked about Connor, about where he came from. I waited. Vivienne absorbed certain attitudes, about background, about money, about what constitutes a family that counts. And those attitudes came from me, and her father, and our household. And I don't know how to fully excuse that, so I won't try. I don't require excuses, I said. No, I imagine you don't. But I wanted you to know that I understand what was said, and why it was wrong, and that I understand the part I played in creating the conditions for it. And I wanted to tell you that I think what you did for Connor, not just the money, but the patience of it, the structure, the way you thought about his future over decades without anyone seeing you do it. I think that's extraordinary. There was a long silence. Not an uncomfortable one. My mother, I said slowly, used to say that the best work is done by people who don't need to watch themselves do it. Yes, Diane said. Yes, that's exactly it. I didn't set up the account to be seen. I set it up because it was the right thing to do with what I had. I know. And I think that's the thing our family has sometimes gotten wrong. We give in ways that are visible. We give in ways that require gratitude, that create a certain structure, a certain relationship of owing. And I've spent some time these past weeks thinking about whether that's actually generosity or whether it's something else. I did not tell her what I thought the something else might be. She clearly already knew. I hope, she said, that whatever happens next, between you and Connor, between you and Vivienne, I hope I can do better by you than we have. I appreciate that, I said. Connor is a very good man, she said. He always has been. I should have said that sooner, and more plainly. He is, I said. I made him that way. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, and she said, I believe you entirely. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Then I called Linda. Diane Hargrove just apologized to me, I said. A long silence. Then Linda said, Tell me everything. Linda came to stay for a weekend in the 5th week. This was not unusual. She visits 3 or 4 times a year. But the visit had a different texture this time. The particular atmosphere of a house where something significant has recently happened and the air has not quite returned to its ordinary density. We worked in the garden on the Saturday. Linda is not a gardener the way I am a gardener. She approaches it with the enthusiasm of someone doing a favor, rather than someone with a genuine practice. But she will weed a bed competently, and she knows the difference between a plant and an interloper, which is the fundamental skill. We worked for 3 hours. We pulled a great deal of bindweed from the vegetable beds. We staked the dahlias, which had grown taller than I expected. At some point, Linda sat back on her heels and looked at me. Are you all right? Actually, all right. Not librarian all right. Librarian all right? When you're managing something, when you've organized your feelings into the correct Dewey Decimal System and shelved them and told yourself they're accessible when needed. I laughed. That's quite accurate. Are you actually all right? I considered it genuinely, the way she was asking me to. I am, I said. I think I am. I think the hardest part wasn't the ceremony. The hardest part was the 3 days after, when I had to decide what I actually wanted. And what do you want? I want my son, I said. I want the real version of him, not the managed version, the one who called on Sundays and talked about his thesis and never mentioned that his wife didn't know who was paying for it. I want the one who sits at my kitchen table and isn't ashamed of any of it. And Vivian? I pulled a long root of bindweed from the soil, the satisfying resistance, and then release of it. I don't know her yet. Not really. I've met the version she performs. I've had one honest conversation with her. I'd like to have more. And if she reverts? Then I'll know, I said. And knowing is better than not knowing. It always is. Linda looked at the dahlias. You know what I think? You're going to tell me. I think you're the most patient person I've ever known, and I think you've spent your whole life being patient with people who didn't deserve it as much as you thought they did. And I think this time, this one time, the patience might actually be justified. High praise, I said. Don't let it go to your head. She picked up her trowel. Now, tell me where the rest of the bindweed is. I want to tell you about the week the scholarship received its first outside donation, because it matters, and because I did not fully anticipate it, and because the things you don't fully anticipate are often the ones that tell you something true. It was the second week of September, roughly 6 weeks after the account had been formally converted to the Clara Josephine Marden Charitable Trust. Gerald Hooper's office managed the trust administration. He had brought in a colleague who specialized in charitable vehicles, a younger woman named Margot who wore very bright scarves and who had the focused efficiency of someone who enjoys untangling complicated things. Margot set up the donation portal, established the review criteria for scholarship applicants, and sent the first announcement to a network of graduate program advisors. The first outside donation came 6 days after the announcement went out. It was not a large donation. $350 from a man in Portland, Oregon, named William Osei, who left a note in the donation field that said, "My daughter Daphne was the first in our family to go to university. She is applying to library science programs this year. Thank you for creating this." I read the note 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Margot and asked her to send the Osei family an acknowledgement, a proper one, personal, not a form letter. Then I called Gerald Hooper. "Gerald," I said, "a man donated $350 because his daughter is applying to a library science program." "That's how it starts," Gerald said, in the comfortable way of someone who has seen many things begin. "How does it end?" "It doesn't end," he said. "That's the point of a trust." I thought about Clara Josephine Marden, sorting mail in rural Pennsylvania, trusting a man at a bank, investing every spare dollar without being able to see the outcome, dying without knowing that her faithfulness would fund a scholarship for a woman named Daphne Osei, whose father in Portland, Oregon, would donate $350 because he wanted to be part of it. "Gerald," I said, "Mrs. Marsh, thank you for the brown cardigan and the index funds and all of it." A pause. "I'll tell you something," he said. "In 26 years, I have never had a client do what you've done with what you started with. I've had clients with 10 times the assets accomplish a fraction of the impact. It's not about the money." "No," I said, "it never is. It's about what you believe the money is for." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly it." Daphne Osei was awarded the first Clara Josephine Marden Scholarship in October. Her application essay was the best of the 11 we received, though I want to be precise here and say that we did not choose it because it was the most moving. We chose it because it was the most precise, the most honest, the most carefully argued. Daphne wrote about what libraries meant to her not as a romantic proposition, but as a practical one. They were the places that had been available when nothing else was. She wrote about the librarian who remembered her name. She wrote about wanting to be that librarian for other people's children. She wrote one sentence that I copied into my journal, which I do not often do with other people's words. The work of a library is the work of believing, on behalf of people who have forgotten how, that knowledge is available to them. I wrote to her personally when the award was announced. Not a form letter, a real letter, on paper, the way I was taught to write. I told her about Clara Josephine Marden. I told her about the postal clerk and the bank and the index funds and the patients. I told her that the scholarship she was receiving was the outcome of a woman who had done a small, faithful thing for many years without any certainty about where it would lead. I told her, I hope the work finds you well. I hope you become the person who remembers the children's names, she wrote back. On paper also. The handwriting was very good. Deliberate, practiced, the handwriting of someone who takes the physical act of writing seriously. She thanked me. She told me about her mother and her father, and about growing up in a house where books were precious because there were few of them, which made each one count more. She told me that she planned to specialize in community library services, rural and underserved areas, the places where the collections are smallest and the need is largest. I read her letter at my kitchen table and thought about a girl sitting in a library on a Tuesday afternoon because her apartment was small and loud, and the library was large and quiet, and there was always a librarian who knew her name. I put the letter in the second drawer of my desk, in the file folder, with all the scholarship documents. It belongs there. It is part of the record. The climbing rose bloomed in the spring. I want to tell you this because I promised I would, in the way you promise things at the beginning of a story, without quite knowing how they will arrive at the end. I planted it in July, the year of the graduation. The same plant I'd brought to the Millbrook house, and which Vivian had moved toward the bin. I had planted its twin along my own back fence, on the trellis I'd built the previous spring, and through the autumn it had set new canes, and through the winter it had waited with the particular patience of dormant things, and in April the buds began to appear. By May it was in bloom. Pink, not red. I hadn't been certain which it would be, because the label at the garden center had said climbing rose, varied without specifying, and the pink was the soft, specific pink of roses that are not trying to perform anything, just what they are. Vivian came to see it. She came in May, on a Saturday morning, by herself. She was still doing this, coming occasionally, without Connor, because she and I had agreed somewhere along the way that the relationship between a mother and a daughter-in-law is its own thing, not an extension of the marriage, and that it needed its own tending. So she brought coffee from a shop in town rather than flowers, which was a good sign. It meant she was paying attention to what I actually wanted, rather than performing a gesture. We sat on the back step with our coffee and looked at the rose. You were right, she said. Another season. Sometimes two, I said. This one was faster. Why? I think it liked the position. South-facing wall, good drainage. It had everything it needed. She held her coffee in both hands, looking at the blooms. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why did you let Connor ask you to keep it secret? For 3 years. You had to know how it might end up looking. I thought about this. It was a fair question and deserved a real answer. Because he's my son, I said. And when your child asks you for something, even when that something is complicated or imperfect, your first instinct is to try to give it to them. He asked me for privacy, and I gave him privacy. I thought he was managing something fragile, and I trusted him to manage it well. And when it became clear he wasn't managing it well? By then I had already committed. The account was structured, the disbursements were in motion, and I had made a decision, I think the right decision even now, that I was not going to use the money as leverage. I wasn't going to hold it over his head or make it conditional. I was going to give it, fully, and trust that the giving itself would matter eventually, even if no one saw it. But someone had to see it eventually, she said. Yes, I said. The program had to print the program, and the dean had to read it out, and you had to hear the name. She looked at the rose. I'm glad I heard it. So am I said. Eventually. She laughed softly. Not in the moment. No, not in the moment. A pair of birds moved through the garden, quick and intent. The morning was warm. The rose moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from where I was sitting. Eleanor, Vivian said. I want you to know something. About how I've been thinking about all of this. All right. I grew up in a family where money was. It was a language. Everything we did with it meant something. Every gift had a structure. Every donation had a purpose. Every loan had a return attached to it, whether or not the return was financial. My father is generous, genuinely, but the generosity always has. It has a shape. It communicates something about who he is and who you are relative to him. I nodded, listening. What you did, what you actually did, I didn't have a category for it. Someone giving without the giving being about them, without it establishing anything, without it creating a debt or a hierarchy or a statement. I'd never seen that. So when Connor told me it was a merit scholarship, I believed him, partly because it was easier, but also partly because the alternative didn't fit any model I had. Someone could give that way, I said, without needing anything back. Yes. I didn't know people did that. Your mother does, I said. She looked at me. What? Diane. Whatever else is true about how your family gave, and I think you're right that there's often a structure to it. Your mother apologized to me without any audience and without any expectation of benefit. That's a particular kind of courage. You might have learned it from her somewhere you didn't notice. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She told me she called you. She did. She said you were. She said you were formidable. She said it like a compliment. I'll take it as one, I said. She smiled. It was the real smile, the one without calibration that I had first heard when she laughed in my kitchen. So will I, if I ever become formidable. You're working on it, I said. Connor came for dinner in June, just the two of us. Vivian was at a work event. The hospitality group was launching something, a new property opening, and she was needed. Connor arrived with wine, as he usually does, and sat at the kitchen table while I finished cooking, as he has done since he was old enough to sit at a kitchen table. And we talked in the easy way we have always talked, when it is just us, and no one needs to be managed. At some point, I put a plate of food in front of him and sat down across from him, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." Are we all right? You and me?" "Really?" I looked at him. He looked like himself. My son. The boy who learned to make pie crust. The one who read every book in the lower shelves by the time he was 10. Also, a 40-something professional with a Millbrook house and a wife and a career he had built, in part, on a foundation I had quietly laid. "Yes," I said. "We're really all right." "I know Connor, I know. You don't have to explain it again." "I want to." I set down my fork. "Then go ahead." He said, "I spent 3 years letting someone I love believe a lie about someone else I love. And I told myself it was to protect both of you, to protect Vivian from from the way her family thinks about needing help, and to protect you from being seen," I said. "Yes." "You told yourself you were protecting me from Vivian's family's judgment." "Yes. But actually you were protecting yourself from having to explain something that complicated your story." He was quiet. "Yes," he said. "I think that's true." "And what was the story you were protecting?" He thought about it. That I made it myself. That I got there under my own power. That coming from Carmody Street was a starting point I'd cleared. Past tense. Something I'd risen above. "And you hadn't risen above it." "I never rose above it. He stopped. "I just brought it with me. You, the house, the lunch notes, all of it. I brought it with me to Harrington, and I brought it into the program, and it's part of how I think, part of how I work. The things you taught me about patience and structure and building slowly. I've used all of it. I just didn't. I didn't say so." "No," I said. "You didn't." "I'm sorry, Mom." "I know. I'll say it as many times as you need me to." "Once more was plenty," I said. "Eat your food." He ate his food. I ate mine. We talked about Daphne Osei and the scholarship. We talked about Gerald Hooper, whom Connor had never met, and who I described with some affection. We talked about the rose, which Connor had not yet seen in bloom, and I told him it was pink, and he said he would come and see it before it finished. After dinner, we sat with tea in the reading room, the room with all the books, the floor-to-ceiling shelves that Vivian had stood in front of and read the spines. Connor sat in the chair opposite mine and looked at the shelves and said, "I used to think this room was the whole world." "It was a good world," I said. "It was," he said. "It still is." So I've been asked, since this became a story that people know about, since the scholarship was established and the announcement was made and people began to reach out in the way they do when something strikes a chord, I have been asked what I would say to other women in similar positions, other mothers, other grandmothers, women who have given and been given nothing back, who have funded and supported and poured themselves out for families that did not see them, now who have sat in third rows and at tables near pillars and received Christmas cards that said Happy Holidays in someone else's handwriting. I have been asked what the lesson is. I think the lesson is this: do not confuse invisibility with insignificance. These are not the same thing, and they are very frequently treated as though they are. The person who is not seen is often the person on whom everything rests, the one whose patience and labor and quiet faithfulness are the load-bearing structure of the whole edifice, and who is invisible precisely because the edifice is standing. You notice the scaffolding when the building collapses. You don't notice it when it's doing its job. This is not a reason to stay invisible. It is a reason to understand that you have always had power, that the invisibility was a choice you made, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for reasons that deserve examination, and that the choice can be unmade. I froze an account. That is what people focus on, because it is the dramatic gesture, the concrete action, the thing that can be narrated. But the account was not the point. The account was simply the mechanism by which I stopped being invisible on someone else's terms and began making myself visible on my own. The point was, I existed. I had always existed. I had funded a young man's education with money I had grown patiently over 30 years from an inheritance I had received from a woman who sorted mail in rural Pennsylvania. I had done this quietly because I was asked to, because I'm patient, because I believe in doing things correctly rather than dramatically. And when a woman stood up in a lobby and said I had paid for nothing, the answer was not to prove her wrong in the lobby. The answer was to prove her wrong in the only way that actually matters, over time, with the full record, in ways that outlasted the moment. The Clara Josephine Marden Charitable Trust will outlast that lobby by decades. I went to see Gerald Hooper in September for what had become our annual review. 38 years of annual reviews, though the first 15 were somewhat more fraught, financially speaking, than the most recent ones. He wore the brown cardigan. I have stopped being surprised by this. It is simply part of him, the way the trowel is part of the garden, the way the reading chair is part of my evenings. We went over the trust figures, the initial endowment, the outside donations, which had continued to grow, slowly, in the way of things that have found their footing, the projected disbursements for the following year. There was enough, Gerald calculated, to fund 2 scholarships rather than 1. Next year, he said, and the year after that, assuming investment performance stays consistent. Then we fund 2, I said. I thought you'd say that. Gerald, I said, I want to ask you something. Of course. Do you remember, 26 years ago, when I came in with $94,000 and told you my goal was to pay for my son's education? He considered this. Gerald is not a man who pretends to remember things he doesn't, which is one of the reasons I've trusted him for 26 years. I remember the conversation, he said. I remember you were very clear about what you wanted. Did you think I'd do it? Yes, he said without hesitation. I thought you'd do it because you came in knowing exactly what you had and exactly what you wanted it to become. People who know those 2 things, what they have and what they want it to become, tend to succeed. Most people know only one or neither. What do most people not know? What they have, he said. They underestimate what they have, and therefore underestimate what it can become. You never did that. I thought about Clara Josephine Martin, about a postal clerk who trusted a man at a bank in 1971 and never stopped, about Daphne Osei, sitting in a library on a Tuesday afternoon because it was large and quiet, and there was always someone who remembered her name. I learned it from my aunt, I said. Then thank your aunt, he said. I do, I said. Every time I'm in the garden. And this is where the story is now. Connor and Vivian come for Sunday lunch approximately twice a month. Sometimes it is at my house on Carmody Street. Sometimes it is at the Millbrook house, where I'm no longer seated near the back door, and where I notice Vivian has made some attempts at the garden. The rose she planted along the back fence is not a climbing rose. It is a shrub rose, compact and tidy, which suits the Millbrook garden better than something that reaches. It is doing well. She asks me about it occasionally with the interest of someone who is genuinely learning, not performing interest. Daphne Osei began her library science program in September. She sent me a postcard from her university town, a small city in the Midwest, green and quiet in the photographs, with a university library that takes up half a city block. The postcard said, "First week, the stacks go on forever. I think I'm home." I put it on the refrigerator, next to a photograph of the climbing rose in full bloom. Linda came for a weekend in October and stood in the back garden and looked at the rose and said, "Well, that was worth the wait." "Most things are," I said. "Not all things," she said. "No," I agreed. "Not all. But the ones that are tend to be the ones you planted yourself." We went inside and had tea at the kitchen table, where Connor did his homework, and I told her about Daphne Osei's postcard and Gerald's projection of 2 scholarships next year. And she listened in the way she always listens, fully, and with her whole attention, the way people listen when they understand that what they're hearing matters. "Mama would be proud of you," she said. "Mama would say, 'Don't get sentimental about it,'" I said. "She'd say, 'Keep the garden and tend the trust, and make sure the filing is organized.'" "She would," Linda said, "and then she'd be proud of you." I looked out the window at the October garden. The rose had finished blooming for the season. The canes were still there, the structure I'd built still holding. Already I knew it was storing what it would need for spring, not visibly, not dramatically, in the private and patient way of things that understand how time works. "I know," I said. "I think she would." And thank you for staying all the way to the end. So the people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.